Hey there, and welcome to the ContentOps forecast, which is mostly sunny with a chance of chaos. Today's webinar is part of our Let's Talk ContentOps webinar series hosted by Sarah O'Keefe, the founder and CEO of Scriptorium. And today we have a rare chance for you to see all three Scriptorium principles in action. We don't often let them get together on calls because it can be mayhem, but helpful mayhem. Today it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm going to pass this over to our resident ContentOps meteorologist, Sarah O'Keefe. Sarah, over to you.
Well, thanks. Well, and it is in fact sunny, although actually hazy, hot, and humid, which is sort of the default for the summer here. Yeah. Hey, everybody. Welcome aboard. It's going to be an interesting ride. We wanted to talk today about where ContentOps is going and what we think our best guess is at the forecast as to what's happening and what are the things that are happening. And, best guess, I think, is really the main thing here. And actually, I wanted to kick it off by talking about one term that we're hearing a lot this year, which is sustainability. So, Alan, I wanted to throw it to you and ask you about sustainability, which I think has become overloaded because it means actually several different things, right?
It does. And let's start with more of the planet-centric view of what sustainability is. From that point of view, it's how your business, how it creates its products, its services. How is the company having an impact on the planet, on the environment? How is it having an effect on the resources that we have on the planet? So it's kind of like an ecological green perspective. And if you take the example of artificial intelligence, what we're in, 4 minutes in, and here comes the first mention of AI. Yay. If you take a look at AI right now, it is probably not something that is super sustainable as it is. It takes a tremendous amount of computing power for AI to do what it does. So it is eating up resources that we have on this planet. And you can kind of dial back from that environmental picture and then start looking at sustainability more from the point of view of, do you have processes in place that are repeatable? Are they scalable? And we're content people, so I want to kind of focus on content. If you are creating content and you are using multiple tools to create different types of output, for example, and I will say I have seen this particularly in the learning and training space. There are very specific tailored tools that get you one kind of delivery target. If you're using a bunch of different tools to both create and then deliver your content, you're not creating a sustainable process. You've got basically multiple irons in the fire, and it's much harder to manage and to come up with kind of a streamlined process. And even think of it from an IT point of view. You're having to basically manage how many tools, how many tools are in your tech stack. At some point that becomes unmanageable, and again, it points back to sustainability. Having all those layers of tools in your tech stack, that probably is actually using more resources from an ecological point of view. So it's not just a matter of looking at things from just an efficiency point of view. It is on the business side, it's also kind of going backward and looking, how is this inefficiency going to affect or have an impact on the world we live in? And again, AI is a perfect example of where I think we're not getting a lot of bang for our buck these days.
Yeah, and so that broader view of sustainability, when we're thinking about, sustainability essentially of our content operations, which includes the environmental kind of considerations, but also others. Bill, what does that look like in your world when you're sitting on the side of these big implementation projects and doing big development projects? What does it look like to manage those projects into something sustainable?
It's a very interesting problem to have, and I tend to look at the the lack of sustainability is more of a churn and burn approach, where you're just, you are working fast and furious to get things out the door, to get things written. And there's not a lot of either forethought or consideration of, what will this need to look like a year from now or 2 years from now, or, oh dear, we suddenly have to go and, publish this in a different language. So a lot of that is really unwinding a lot of ad hoc processes and ad hoc code, and streamline that. We talk about, the lack of sustainability. We talk about, ad hoc processing, and all of that really comes down to building a pretty significant mountain of technical debt. So, it's a lot of short-term decisions, and it might have been a great idea at the time. It might have been a proof of concept that got you to a specific endpoint. But a lot of times, if you don't take a look at what you developed there or what you did there and refine it, you're just going to pile on problems as you keep building on top of it. So, and a lot of times it's really easy to just say, oh, we'll fix that tomorrow. But a lot of times tomorrow becomes tomorrow, and it never gets fixed.
Quick and dirty becomes very expensive, basically.
Oh, yes. And the longer you let that sit, the more expensive it is to fix it later.
And dirtier.
And dirtier.
Now we're going to segue right into a micro dirty jobs kind of presentation. So we have a poll about sustainability of content ops, and, pretty mixed bag. Some people are saying they have it, but we gave you 4 answers. And the winner right now is no. It's not a majority, but, it looks like about a quarter said yes, about 40% said no. About a quarter said other. Oh, now it's changing again. Anyway, so, not a lot of people saying that their content ops are sustainable. That much I can tell you. A lot of people are saying other, which tells me you probably have some other questions about this. Speaking of questions, if you have them, drop them in the Q&A, and we will do our best to get to those as we go. We already had one kind of interesting one come in, which had to do with doc ops. So somebody said, what's the difference basically between doc ops and content ops? And the answer I've given, Alan and Bill, is that doc ops tends to be focused on developer docs as opposed to broadly content. And content ops is content ops, which could potentially include doc ops. Is that a reasonable definition? Bill, what do you think?
I think it's reasonable to say, we also talk about having, global content ops, which then extends it further into the entire localization process. So, generally ops, at the end of the day, it's ops wrapped around a thing.
Okay, that's fair. So, Alan, you were talking about, well, both of you were talking about, quick and dirty. And I think really that leads us into a term that many of you on this call are probably familiar with, which is technical debt. So the idea of technical debt is that when you make a decision, when you go into a project, if you do the quick and dirty thing, then it's cheap in the short run, but you introduce technical debt. You're going to have to fix it later. You didn't pay the full price. And, you have debt, and that debt accumulates and has interest. And then eventually you're going to have to pay the piper on this. So, Bill, do you have some examples of what this looks like, what technical debt looks like in a real project? And please do not name any names.
Sure. Well, Alan had a good one where, especially within the learning industry, you have a lot of these tools that are designed to do a very specific thing. And what we see more often with the work that we do is that you have a group of people who are trying to author in a consolidated fashion. So they're trying to create a single source of truth. They're trying to do the right thing, but they've now created all of these custom publishing pipelines that go out to all of these other places that have a single purpose publishing mechanism. So you're publishing out to an LMS so that you can do e-learning. And then likewise, you're publishing out to a website that, supports web content. You're publishing out to PDF. And sometimes the tool that you're using to author the content may not have all of those connectors. And what we've seen, especially with a lot of early adopters, for those who decided to centralize their content, is that they had to use some, let's call it creative coding, to get from point A to point B and point C. And that creative coding solved the problem. But fast forward, 5, 10, 15 years of doing this process, the code becomes brittle, and things start falling apart, especially as some code, some things that were developed are slowly getting deprecated because other systems refuse to talk in that language anymore, and you start having to do workarounds to your workaround to get it to work continually. So unwinding a lot of that stuff can get rather dicey and rather expensive, because somewhere along the way, someone may have decided that, hey, mid-process, we're going to start injecting other content in here. Now you have to accommodate for 2 content pipelines going out, and it gets even more confusing from there. Another is, I guess on the flip side, is more, brute force publishing. So you either spend the time creating a proof of concept, publishing pipeline, and the thought is that you will harden it and refine it and nurture it. But at the end of the day, the proof of concept gets streamlined into basically your production environment, and it becomes the golden way of publishing. And it becomes very inflexible. It's very fragile because it was built as an example, not as a solution. Again, reworking that becomes difficult.
And Alan, I did want to turn to you. The canonical example, though, of that prototype brute force publishing is you build a proof of concept that is basically English only, and a whole bunch of stuff gets hard coded in. And then along comes the production version, which is, 37 languages. And nobody thought about the fact that the note, caution, warning text would have to be localized. That's actually a terrible example because it's built into most of these things, but it's that type of thing. It all got hard coded in, and now somebody has to go in and unwind every place where note is typed in and put in a string that can then be swapped out for various languages. And had that been done in the prototype, it would have taken an extra 2%, but it wasn't. And so here we are. This is exactly the same thing as retrofitting a house for accessibility, like grab bars, elevators, wider door frames, versus building a house that is accessible on day one. Doing it up front is more expensive than making an inaccessible cheap house, and very much less expensive than build the cheap house and then later add accessibility. And Alan, I want to get you in here about some of the sustainability issues, some of the technical debt that you're seeing on your side of the fence.
I'm more on the content modeling IA side of things. And there are cases where I should say there's 2 different sides of this coin. There are cases where you don't do enough work, enough planning to think about what might be coming in the future. What if your product or service lines are going to multiply or split? Can you accommodate that with your content model? Is it going to be able to handle the fact that instead of having maybe 4 models, you're going to have 8? And then like 2 of those are sort of related, 6 aren't, or whatever. There's all these kinds of possibilities and combinations. Is your content model, quote, smart enough and forward thinking enough to accommodate changes in how many offerings that you have? Is it flexible enough to be published to different formats, some of which you don't even know about? If you are basically creating these giant monolithic chunks of text, how is that going to look or break up? How are you going to handle that when you have to deliver to a tablet, to a phone, things like that? So the way that you have put together your content model absolutely has an impact on how clean, and I hate to say the word easy, because nothing's really easy in this content world, but how cleanly that's going to come over. What's the level of effort it is going to take to get that content in to these new distribution channels? On the flip side of that coin, not doing enough or being forward thinking, sometimes people get too much into the weeds and they over engineer and make things so difficult that the authors are going to have trouble writing in that structure because it's just this incredibly dense and complex structure, and it makes it very hard to figure out, am I doing this right? Am I adding in the right information? And people just shut down. So you've got to find that sweet spot between not enough thought and not really thinking about the future and, oh my God, we've got everything in here, let's do this. And it makes it so tangled nobody can actually use it. So
Goldilocks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think additional to all of those things, and we're sort of slowly working our way backwards, where we started by talking about the publishing pipeline, and now we're talking about content model. Before that, there's vendor lock-in. Now, vendor lock-in is really interesting because we used to talk about, oh, you have this proprietary format and we're going to put our stuff in your terrible proprietary format, and then getting things in and out is awful. However, even if your tool, vendors, if you're on this call, you just look away. This is not for you. Even if your tool that you're purchasing is on paper based on a standard, like they're like, we're did a CCMS, we're based on DocBook, we blah blah blah, whatever. Even in those cases, you are going to have some vendor lock-in. What you're going to run into is potentially the standard has been mangled / modified into that particular tool's flavor of the standard, which introduces problems, and Bill touched on this, you're going to build a bunch of custom connectors because you need to get your content from over here into, I don't know, Salesforce or Zendesk or something like that. And there's not an out-of-the-box connector, so you have to build your own. And if you lift and shift, if you move your content into a different system, you have to do that connector again. Connectors to translation management systems. So there are all these cases where you are going to have vendor lock-in because of maybe how the tool was architected, but more likely because of these connectors that you legitimately need, and that as you're working through them, you run into this problem that the connector is custom code, right? And so we're right back to Bill's custom publishing pipelines. So you want to be really, really careful in thinking about this up front and thinking about, if I choose this tool, this probably CCMS, as the foundational element of my content ops environment, what does that mean down the road in terms of vendor lock-in? How am I going to be locked in? And what do I do about that? Like, how do I address that? And we have seen so many projects that we need to replatform from system A to system B, and it costs the earth because of these vendor lock-in issues, even though, potentially they were built on a DITA standard and it should be just fine, but it's not. And Bill, did you have a couple of other examples of this that you wanted to talk about a little bit, or should I move on to the content side of things?
No, I think you hit most of it. But yeah, that's all of the customizations that need to happen inside one specific system. When you start thinking specifically about replatforming or, lifting and shifting to another system, all of those customizations need to somehow be genericized, unwound, retained in some fashion to move it to another one until you are ready to build a different approach for your content, your publishing, what have you. So there's a lot to consider there. It's not just about getting content out. It's about getting it's about getting your content operations or your manifestation of your content operations out of that system and implemented somewhere else.
Right. And again, the flip side of that, since we're just going to do backflips today, there's a question here from the audience which touches on this. And what she's saying is, her team's content ops, and I think this is the, by implication, the tech writing team or the content team, is sustainable. So they have a CCMS, they have a publishing portal, and that's all working, and that's great. But the rest of the company isn't, and I can't, and this is in her words, I can't seem to get other teams or orgs in the company to get on the content ops bandwagon. It's tough to build a case that's compelling to all teams, sports, services, marketing, sales. They all have their own agenda, any insider advice. And this is precisely the reason that people end up investing in connectors, right? So you build a connector to the support knowledge base so that you can then put people into a unified system. And that's the tension that we're kind of looking at here, is that we want unified content. We want unified content ops, unified content deliverables, just like a unified delivery or presentation across the company. But the component content management system that is appealing to the professional technical writers tends to not be appealing to the knowledge-based people or the e-learning people. And so what do we do with that? I don't have a good answer. I mean, this is a really, really good question. And I think the only answer is you have to make the business case and get, high level support for this. But what are some of the other things that we can touch on here?
The only other thing I might mention here, a lot of the content vendors are seeing this problem and how you really need an enterprise content strategy to cover content of all types: product content, learning and training content, marketing content, support content. And they're seeing this, and they're creating these ecosystem of tools that play well with each other, and they support the needs for that particular group. And you're right, a marketing group needs something for content creation and distribution that is quite different than the people in the product content section. So these tools are doing a better job, or these tool ecosystems, I should say. They group these related tools together that play pretty well together, so you can start having this more cohesive structure and perhaps not as many of these custom connectors between tools that really don't generally talk to each other.
I do want to talk about solutions, and some of where do we think this is going and what do we think is going to happen. But before I do, I wanted to just touch briefly on we're focused on content ops, but another form of technical debt is bad content, right? Content that is poorly written, badly structured, badly organized, grammatically incorrect, hasn't been translated, like that whole universe of stuff. And there are a lot of companies that have enormous amounts of terrible content. And as a side note, one of the reasons that I think AI took hold was that executives looked at it and said, well, yeah, I mean, it's not great, and it's going to write content that's not necessarily all that accurate. But you know what? We're doing that by hand right now. We have people writing content that's not all that great right now. So fine, let the AI do it, which is a kind of a troubling thing. We did ask about technical debt in your content ops in the poll, and it looks like about a third of you are saying we are drowning. And I'm sorry. About half of you are saying we can manage it. 8% of you, I don't like you anymore because you said we have no technical debt. And I'd like to know how you pull that off, because that sounds awesome. And then there was a small percentage of other. But it sounds as though, at least half of you or more than half are saying we're in good shape. We're okay. But a third are saying it's bad. And so let's turn our attention to, I guess, that third and what it is that the solutions look like. How do we solve this problem? What does it look like to fix this? And what are kind of the trends that we're seeing in fixing these things? What are some of the solutions?
I think step one is, if you are drowning in technical debt, you need to literally stop, take a deep breath, and look around you and see which things are holding you up, which ones of those are absolutely critical, and which ones really need to be focused on to be fixed. And again, you can't approach this as fix this one thing and then everything will be fine. Even if it does solve one specific problem, you need to bubble it back and start looking at your overall content strategy and the operations that you build from that strategy to see, what needs to be in place. It could be building, better source structure up front, so making sure that you're not, as Alan mentioned, that you're in, a kind of a Goldilocks zone where your structure isn't too loose or too constricting, and it's designed to get you where you need to be. From that point, I think the best solution there is to start looking at automation where you can build it in. And that doesn't mean going out and building, or buying new things necessarily, but looking at the capabilities that are afforded to you with what you have and making the best use of those. Automate where you can.
Yeah,
I think it's worth pointing out too, sometimes you're going to need a lifeguard to pull you out of this pool of technical debt. You are going to need third-party help. And yes, I'm going to do the shameless consultant routine here and say, get somebody in to help you identify the problems, maybe do some triage, what needs to be fixed, what is the flow of those fixes, how does fixing one help with another, etc. And even if consulting budget is not in your future, try to hire somebody perhaps who has that kind of experience, maybe somewhere else, and can give you that third party point of view on what is broken and help you identify those things. It is so easy to kind of get numb to the broken things. You just accept it. This is what I have to do to get my job done. And you just kind of go with the flow, even though the flow really is horrible. But you kind of just put up the walls and just handle it and do what you need to do. That's why a third party can be really helpful to say, hey, this is super gross. I cannot believe that you are even able to function at all doing this with your process. Let's look at ways we can start to triage and fix this. So kind of like Bill was saying, step back, but sometimes you need a third party to help you do that well. And it doesn't always have to be a consultant that does it.
And in further evidence that we all share a single brain, the example that I was thinking of was actually a rip current. If you're caught, they've been in the news. If you're caught in a rip current, your first job is to not drown and not to swim back against the rip current, right? Because you're not going to win. Your job is to get out of the rip current and or get a life ring or a board, some sort of flotation device to keep yourself alive until you can get some help. So, you can't win if you're drowning in technical debt. So you have to get out of the drowning in whatever way. That might mean get some help. As Alan's saying, it might mean, you swim 90 degrees to the rip current, right? That gets you out of it. Then you can float and wait for somebody to come along and rescue you. So there are a bunch of different ways that you can potentially do that look like swimming sideways, right? And automation is a great example, because if you can just automate a few things, that gives you a couple of hours, and that gives you that time and that bandwidth to help yourself and, try and get out of this really bad situation. Structure, automation. I'll also say that you really want to think about long-term flexibility, because if you solve things, again, you solve it, but then you didn't solve it because in a year, a new requirement comes along and you can't meet that requirement. So you have this issue that you sort of have to work through. I have to survive, and then I can get some bandwidth to do this. And so that leads us straight into, where we live, which is content ops. How do you make this sustainable in the long term so that it all works? And I think the big problem that we're seeing right now, and this is, again, the forecasting issue, is that these projects, these initiatives, these efforts take time and money and resources, whether internal or external. And right now we have an awful lot of large organizations that are not interested in talking about long term. They're interested in what can you do for me next week or next month or maybe next quarter. But, it's going to take 6 months to dig ourselves out of this hole that we've built over the past 10 years is not a popular position. And so it's just very, very difficult to get people to go along with that, to help us with that, and to start moving into these initiatives so that we can fix what we're doing. And so shifting a little bit into that forecasting and that solutioning mode, what does it look like to invest in structured content or better content, right? It doesn't have to be structured, but what does it look like to make that case in this short-term environment? I don't know which one of you wants to touch on that. Maybe Bill?
Sure. And I think it's, to tie right into that, it's about, having a results focus in your pitch to begin with. So if you know that you need to change, that you need to build in some sustainability, you need to focus on the results. What that looks like is going to be very different from you versus those who are going to approve any funding that you're going to get, because the results that those who are in the approval stage are looking at, that might be a website, a PDF, a mobile app. So if you are still able to produce a PDF, a website, and a mobile app, then why do you need to change the way you're working now? And so you need to start being able to articulate other gains. So it's not just, yes, I'm able to produce these things, but I am able to produce these things in a third of the time. I am able to produce these things in 7 languages instead of 2 in the same amount of time. Or I am able to produce these things in 30 languages that we haven't been able to do before within the same budget. Those are things that start getting attention, and we need to start building those into, start building that into the business plan for, your pitch.
Yeah,
Well,
I agree with that. Sorry, go ahead, Alan.
I was going to say, here I go again with the AI BS. Excuse me, all. But AI is hot right now. It is maybe overly hot. Even so, it is. You can look at it from a content point of view as another delivery target. And if your content that you have right now is pure crap, guess what? What AI generates from it is going to be even worse crap, probably. So if you have an edict that you need to start focusing on how AI can basically be a distribution channel or can somehow consume your content, that can possibly be a way to get your foot into the content ops door and say, listen, we got to clean this stuff up, make this existing content better, and that way it will make the AI less likely to hallucinate, less likely to give information that might be potentially cause legal problems. So there can be some things you can do there to basically focus on how good content is the bedrock of a lot of things, and that includes the direction AI is heading.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I'll add to that, and I've come around on this over the years, because I used to say, okay, you've got to do your planning, and then you've got to do your thing, and then you've got to do, and eventually we'll deal with formatting down, like way down the line. Like a year from now, we'll fix your PDFs. I've come around to the idea that that's not going to work, and your proof of concept, your prototype, your first initiative, whatever it is going to have to include something visual. And what I mean by that is we're going to redesign the PDF. We're going to redesign the website. We're going to deliver this HTML differently, something like that, because people, more or less, are visual. People want to see something. They want to see, your CFO wants to see numbers. Great. All the rest of them that you're trying to get approval from, if you don't give them a visual, hey, we're going to go from it looks like this to it looks like this, it just doesn't connect. And so even though from a pure technology point of view, it makes way more sense to do the planning and the content architecture and the build and the implementation, the configuration, and then the publishing pipelines, I think you're going to have to include a publishing pipeline of some sort up front at the beginning so that you can visually show a difference, even though from a technical point of view, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But my sense is you will not get your project approved if you don't have a visual to show. And that kind of makes me twitch, because if you look at how that project should be laid out, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But just file that away under things that you're probably going to have to do. I've got a really interesting question here in the chat about integrated systems. How do you even get to an integrated system, this viewer asks, in an agile production process where content is atomic, fragmented, and hard to trace? Well, I mean, other than that. So I'm going to throw this to you, Bill, as the technical person, but I'll say a few things first. We have the ability to make content atomic and track it in things like component content management systems. If fragmented means scattered across the universe, then yes, that is definitely a problem and needs to be fixed. And we have techniques for traceability, for saying this content was created because of this bug. This JIRA ticket resulted in this content update, which results in this, or this product requirement resulted in this content feature, which then results in this content, that type of thing. So I don't think there's anything inherent to Agile that would make things fragmented, hard to trace. Atomic, probably yes, but we have tools that can address that. So I think this is a case where I would lean on software, because all three of these things that you're asking about sound to me like something that I can solve with software. And Bill, does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going to be going, because I was looking at that last item of hard to trace, and that right there smells like, it smells like technical debt, because you have developed things and now you can't track where they are, where they're being used, when they were last updated. At least I assume by that term, that's what you mean. We can certainly manage, atomic, and we can certainly manage fragmented. Hard to trace. Once you lose something, it's very hard to wrap your arms around where it went and where it now is all being used. So that's something that you unfortunately are going to have to backtrack and rebuild once you get things centralized. And I do say centralized, even though you're talking about atomic and fragmented. If you centralize it, you can push to those places. You don't necessarily need to author or store content in a million different spots. You can manage it all centrally and push it out to where it needs to be at the time it's needed, and not have to worry about that. And that'll reduce that hard to trace bit of debt that you have.
Okay,
when I saw that question, the atomic angle, I'm like, that's good. That can work to your advantage. It's a matter of finding a system to help you manage those atomic bits and pieces and give you some governance so you don't lose things and they become hard to trace.
Yeah, I will say, it's when we talk fragmentation, and it's fragmentation across something like multiple Git repositories, that is in fact super tricky, and that's one of the reasons that that's where you run into issues with DocOps, is when, and this idea of docs as code and all the rest of it. If the docs are associated with the code, but the docs need to share across multiple code repositories, things get really annoying really fast. I wanted to turn to the forecasting, and Alan, you touched on AI a little bit. To me, we are seeing a slightly more nuanced view of AI as, hey, this could help us. It's an interesting tool. We can do stuff with it, but it's not going to just like take over our world. It's more, I think, a more accurate and more nuanced version of what it can potentially do for us. Does that sound right to you?
It does. I'm still seeing on LinkedIn in particular all of these ads in my feed. This AI thing will do all this for you. Very, there's still a little bit of snake oil salesmanship going on, unfortunately. But I do think overall, at least when you talk to people more, especially in the content trenches, I think there is some cooling off, and maybe people are realizing it is not going to fix the world, because it ain't. It just is not. So
yeah. but it's a great tool and it can
Yeah.
help us. I mean,
Yeah.
there's some cool stuff we can do with
Absolutely.
it. Bill, what are you seeing in terms of forecast, what people are saying, what the trends are?
I'm going to bring in a bit of a gray cloud here, but yeah, there's if you haven't been paying attention lately, there have been quite a lot of layoffs in tech, and that's causing a lot of people to get scared, overwhelmed, especially not so much those who are being laid off, although that's a specifically, I mean, they have their own problems and concerns that they need to manage, but those who are left behind at a company, I will put it that way because that's literally what we're seeing. Those who are left behind suddenly have to manage systems and processes that they no longer, that they never really had expertise in, and so we're seeing a lot of small improvements that people are making because they just don't know everything about the way something was hooked up before. And because of that, there's a reluctance to really ask for a lot of help, whether it's to ask for funding because company just had a layoff. There's no way that they're going to give me money so that I can ramp up on this thing. They're not going to ask for help from other departments because those departments are now understaffed potentially. So there's a lot of flailing, I guess, because of people not being willing to stick their neck out and say, hey, I need help. Hey, we need to change the way we're working. Hey, we have to spend money, even though we just let go of a lot of people because we didn't have money. I'm not sure where to turn that around, but that is definitely what we've been seeing, at least over the past 6 to 9 months, and specifically.
What you're describing to me is another not so tasty flavor of technical debt, because when the people who knew how to run those systems are no longer there, it's like pulling out the rug from under the people who do still have to keep things running. What if you don't know how these things work, how they are connected? That's a kind of technical debt, and it is frightening to be in that position, especially when getting more resources is probably not on the table.
Mm-hmm. Or you are in charge of a completely new initiative that relies on another group or another system, and now you don't have, I guess, a reliable pool of people to draw upon for that old system because they've all been let go.
Yeah. So first of all, for those of you that are on this call that have been laid off recently, I literally started this company because I was mad about being laid off. And there's a whole backstory there, which is pretty entertaining now. At the time, it wasn't very entertaining at all. So I really feel for what you're dealing with. It's life-changing, and sometimes ultimately it's life-changing in a good way. Sometimes it's not. It's always extremely, extremely stressful. What you should know is that nearly always it has nothing to do with your capabilities and your competencies, no matter what certain companies might be saying. And it's just, they changed direction. They didn't have the money. They made a bad bet on a bad strategy, and you got to pay the price for that instead of the executive, right? On the survivor side, the people that stay on the inside that are still there, nobody wants to stick their neck out, right, and risk anything because, oh, well, they'll just fire me next. So there's this very unhealthy response that happens to layoffs and fear and concerns about people's jobs. People don't want to take a risk or be visible. They just want to put their heads down and do the work because that seems to be, how you get the job done, probably. I have had, and for those of you that think, oh, she's talking about me, I'm not talking about you. I have had several calls over the last couple of months that boil down to, hey, the people or the person that ran our system is gone. We don't know how to manage it. What do we do? Can you help us? That's a sign of somebody that didn't think through a layoff, right? Because they let go somebody that had a unique skill set and they had no backup. So that is really, really troubling and really, really not healthy at all. Alan, what are some of the other trends that we're seeing?
I think tied into what you're talking about with these people kind of scared to ask for money for new initiatives, for those who are trying to move forward with a new initiative, things are taking longer to get approved. The window and the procurement process, they're dragging a little more now. And it could be because people are a little kind of shell shocked by some of the layoffs, and there's this fear of, I don't want to, step across the line and cause myself problems. And I think that is all kind of tied together in a not so fun package right now.
Yeah, the approvals, the approval for $50,000 that used to go to a director is now going to a VP. The approval for $200,000 or $300,000 is going, a level higher than it used to go. That type of thing. Everything's taking forever, even when there are, legitimate projects there. Bill, what else is out there?
Yeah, I was going to say that, those approvals are definitely stalling, but I think more importantly, the ones that are gaining more traction tend to be the bigger initiatives these days. So it's not so much looking for that, that $50,000 fix to one particular aspect of, let's say, content production, but it's basically a full overhaul, saying, okay, we did it this way for 10 years. It's worked great. Do we invest in making these iterative improvements on this system, or do we flat out go for a completely new way of doing things? And yeah, these bigger initiatives tend to squeak by on the approvals a lot faster, or at least a lot more consistently than a lot of the smaller ones. The smaller ones may come and go. Might be a good idea at the time, but for whatever reason, at the last possible minute, the approval gets yanked for getting that done. The bigger ones, they tend to have a lot more business case driving them. They have a lot more potential behind them, and I think they have a lot more momentum in getting through all the approval stages to actually getting funding.
I think Alan's right that, AI right now is an easy approval mechanism, right? I need to do X so that we can AI is pretty much the message. It's true and it's helpful. I will say that sustainability, we feel like, is also a place where you can get some traction. So partly, sustainability in terms of environmental stuff, but also in terms of business sustainability of operations, scalability, velocity, that type of thing. We see that working actually pretty well as a pitch. But I think the key is that you have to be results oriented. You have to focus on, we need to do this because of a business outcome. What doesn't seem to be working at all is focusing on content quality. Like, our content isn't good, we need to make it better. They're like, don't care. Okay, why are you making it better? If we improve the quality of our content, we will get fewer product returns, which quantifies to these kinds of numbers, or better tech support, which means fewer calls, call deflection, that kind of thing. But it is absolutely critical to connect whatever the content initiative thing is that you're trying to do to a business outcome. Connecting it to the content is going to be better and shinier. And I know I told you to make a pretty PDF or a pretty HTML page. You also have to do that, but you have to simultaneously connect it to a specific business outcome, or it will not go. It just will not.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
No, I was going to, yeah, exactly. And it needs to be quantifiable. So, things like, being able to, reduce the number of product returns is a good one. Reduce the number of support calls is a good one. Another one would be being able to publish at within the same time frame to 6 more language markets. Being able to pull that publishing in by a quarter, a month, 2 months. So that you can get the content out to those markets sooner, so that you can get your product out to those markets sooner. Those things have very, very, very tangible things that you can measure. And we talk about metrics. Everyone talks about metrics. Everyone loves metrics, and everyone hates metrics. But those are things that you can tie numbers to very easily.
Yeah, Alan, any final things you want to tie into here?
Really, the cold hard business result angle, it's some variation of show me the money, because it is. And better words, it's more grammatically correct and flows better. That ain't gonna cut it. It's just not.
But it'll work better in machine translation because it's more grammatically correct and the sentences are shorter and simpler. That you might be able to do. Ultimately, I think that what we're seeing, though, is a core tension between the time scale required to do big content ops projects and the time scale that business writ large is operating on right now. So if you're operating on a what does my next quarter, what does my next week, what does my next 6 weeks look like kind of time scale, and a content ops project is 3 months, 6 months, a year, there's a real disconnect there between the time scale for the content stuff and the time scale for business. So ultimately, you have to find a way to break down your project into bite size, in the cadence of the business pieces so that you can get those approved. That, I think, is going to be a big, big challenge. And I would encourage those of you that are wrestling with this to look over at digital transformation, because they have more or less solved this. You see these monster millions of dollars of digital transformation projects, and they get approved, right? And they're not going to happen in 6 weeks. So how are they doing that? What does the messaging look like? Lean on that, learn from what's happening in that digital transformation world, because ultimately that's what you're trying to do, right? You're trying to do content ops, which amounts to digital transformation, but specifically for content as opposed to for sort of business operations. I think with that, I'm going to wrap it up unless either of you want to jump in with anything else that we've got here.
I think we've covered the gamut here today.
Agreed.
All right. Well, Christine, Bill, sorry.
No, I totally agree with Alan. I think we've hit everything. I could throw out an example of one thing that might make digital transformation more appealing, I guess, and that's that it signifies actual change. It's not that you're just operationalizing. It's not that you're just doing a tech project, but you are transforming the way that your company is doing business.
Yeah. All right, Christine, back to you, I think.
Yeah, well, thank you all so much for being here. Please head to the rating the webinar tab. That would be really helpful. We just really want to hear what you liked, what you didn't like. If you have any other questions too, feel free to ask them on the Ask a Question tab, and we can send you a follow-up email with more information. And keep an eye out for our next webinar, which is going to be September 18th. A great way to stay updated with our future webinars and other content is via our newsletter, our Illuminations newsletter, which is in that attachments tab. And yeah, thank you so much for being here. Enjoy the rest of your day.